Now, it says here, what are the material sustainability issues impacting the tech sector? And how are the tech sector, government, and society responding? How are you responding? How can tech help with the issues of sustainability in other sectors? We'll consider, and that's Suzanne particularly, we'll consider some of the latest policy developments, tech sustainability trends, and the challenges that remain to be resolved. And Margot will say something more about that. So our session today is me giving this preamble, followed by Suzanne Baker, who's this Associate Director for Climate, Environment and Sustainability at techUK. I think she's the one who's responsible for these dark, gloomy days we've been having, but also the sunshine. And then Margot. And you can see their credentials there, and they're very impressive credentials too. So we'll have Suzanne, and then Margot, and then we'll have Q&A by you. So please do enter your questions, enter your topics for discussion into the Q&A, and we will pick them up during the session and make sure that Suzanne and Margot get to answering them afterwards. And we, in this instance, is myself, Santana, and David. So we're all here for you. Now, all you have to do is sit back, enjoy, and think of some questions. So first of all, let me introduce Suzanne Baker, Associate Director, Climate, Environment and Sustainability in techUK. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. I'm just going to share my slides. So here we go. Yep, so as Dalim kindly said, I'm Associate Director at techUK. I don't know if you know techUK, but we are a trade association for companies operating in the digital economy. We have all the big tech firms that you would expect to be members of an organisation like ours, but lots of SMEs beside. So our membership spans data centres, telcos, consumer electronic manufacturers, and companies working with AI, cloud, edge, quantum, you name it. And the work that I do at techUK is to lead our efforts on climate, environment and sustainability. And that covers not just the impact of the sector, but also how digital technologies can be deployed to help other sectors decarbonise as well. And we have a particular focus on energy, mobility and cities. So I'm just going to minimize that. Great. So yeah, we've got about 150 members that span the entire digital ecosystem. And I should have mentioned we've got data center operators in membership as well. So just to start off with, I think one of the things that I've noticed as I've been doing this role is that there is this kind of tendency to think of digital technologies as only enabling efficiencies and thus subject to the Chevron's paradox, which, if you aren't familiar with it, says that if you make something easier to do, you'll just do more of it. So you cancel out the efficiency that you've gained. But actually, there's so much more capabilities that you can extract from digital technologies that make them really, really useful for net zero. And as sectors plan their net zero transition. So, for example, tracking and verification. We're seeing blockchain being used, for example, in the context of the circular economy. If you aren't familiar with that, that's the idea that instead of taking, making and disposing of something, we keep resources in a continual loop. What blockchain enables us to do is to track materials and products through supply chains. And that's being used by some companies to measure emissions that are being generated along the supply chain, to also assess where assets are at any one point in time. We're also seeing blockchain being used to support emissions trading as well, both on a very local level, but also to validate and verify emissions trading internationally. And I think the most famous example of that is IBM's blockchain being used in China for their emissions trading scheme. Another key area is around optimizing, predicting and modeling. An example here could be, for example, in the energy sector, where we are moving rapidly from a position where we have around 300 actors and processes that make up our energy system on a very basic level. But as we decarbonize, decentralize, and start to roll out renewable energy technology, and in future start to incorporate more energy storage, we will have many more assets and possible tools at our disposal. And I think that I hear Laura Sands, who chairs the Energy Digitalisation Task Force that was recently launched, say that we're moving from 300 actors to around 10 million actors and assets that all have to be managed, and which makes machine learning, ideal for helping to predict energy use and energy demand at any one time, so we can match production with and forecast what's going to be generated from renewables, and perhaps even send signals to energy users to use less when there is lots of high carbon electrons on the electricity grid. Another key application is in integrating and mapping data. And so one example here could be around the use of geospatial data. The Geospatial Commission has recently published its annual report about how it intends to work in the coming year. And one of the key focus for them is actually mapping transport data, which obviously helps people to plan to use public transport and hopefully reduce their reliance on traditional forms of transportation, and particularly the car. Because even though EV rollout is going to be hugely important to decarbonize our transport sector, it has to be accompanied with more public transport and active traveling as well. So that it could play a really key role. And we're already seeing it manifest in cities through apps like Citymapper. There is also the ability to sense and connect and actuate, and I guess linked to that is to stimulate, and digital twins are emerging as potentially a really powerful tool at our disposal to, again, kind of if we look again at the energy sector, who seem to, we can see the opportunities for applying digital technologies in the energy sector very clearly. And we could use digital twinning to help local authorities understand where they need to make grid reinforcements, for example. And in fact, the Octopus Centre for Net Zero, which has recently launched, one of the first projects they're embarking on is a digital twin of the electricity network. So lots of really exciting applications, and I've just picked a handful of use cases, and we're hearing more and more use cases every day. So we think the potential is huge. In fact, we did a report with Deloitte last year to kind of understand what impact digital technology is already making in carbon abatement. And what Deloitte suggested, their research kind of indicated, was that using digital technologies that are already proven and already out there in the field can enable a reduction of 7.3 million tonnes of UK carbon emissions by 2030, which is 15% of the reductions we need to make by 2030 to keep within our carbon budget. And at the same time, we can unlock GVA benefits of around 13.7 billion. You know, as I mentioned, this is only based on the use cases and digital technology applications that are already out there. We know that there is you know, much more potential than what is already being done. So I think we can safely say that, you know, there is you know, masses of opportunity in applying digital technologies to the climate crisis. And if you missed it, the Royal Society did an excellent report following an inquiry which involved hundreds of academics towards the end of last year. It's called Digital Technologies and the Planet. And they said that globally, digital technologies could in fact cut emissions by 30% of what's needed. They pointed particularly at machine learning and digital twins as key tools that we should be thinking more about deploying for climate action. So I do encourage you to have a look at that report if you've not checked it out already. So these round circles at the bottom, these are figures from the report with Deloitte, and that's just showing you kind of how that emission reductions is carved up. So by far the biggest benefits are within the digital energy system, along actually with smart manufacturing is another area where actually they're forecasting, you know, significant carbon reductions. But there are also some sizable applications within mobility. And within techUK, one of the things that we're working on at the moment is with the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force. In fact, we're leading the data package for the task force because, I mean, one of the sources of frustration for consumers at the moment who own electric vehicles is the lack of charging infrastructure. And even if you do go find a charging point that's free, it might belong to a supplier that you're not subscribed to. Clearly, that's a really poor experience for the consumer and something that might be off-putting. So the intention is to create a data infrastructure that sits behind those charging infrastructure points and allows consumers to use whatever charging point, regardless of who they are subscribed to. And the other kind of area which we're interested in from a techUK perspective is around smart and connected homes. And largely the savings here are related to smart thermostats because it can directly reduce the amount of heat that a house needs. And clearly that is a major source of direct carbon emissions in the home. So yeah, this is mainly smart energy, smart thermostats, a bit around home energy management systems. But again, we can see greater potential in future as more homes start to have their own energy storage. You know, perhaps electric vehicles could act as an energy storage device whereby in future you can be notified by your energy supplier or motivated by your energy supplier to sell the energy stored on your battery at times when renewable energy is not so prolific. And then to store energy when there's lots of low carbon electrons on the grid. So we think there's you know, much more significant potential of digital technologies helping to save energy in the home, but also supporting a flexible and reliable energy system when we have one that's dominated by renewable energy. But of course, you know, these technologies do come with challenges. And we're kind of working our way through these issues as we as we engage with sectors and the market and plan for net zero. So, you know, these shouldn't be a surprise to you, but I'll run through it very quickly. I mean, clearly data privacy and surveillance remains a concern for people. Who owns data, how should it be managed, and who can access it are all key challenges. I'm really pleased to see Icebreaker One leading some excellent work on energy data at the moment. But it's a huge challenge and one that we still need to work through. And COVID has shown to us and starkly highlighted the digital divide. You know, is there a risk that we risk marginalizing those who are already suffering from a lack of access to data and digital technologies if we use digital to support further sector transitions? And also, emerging tech is complex. How can we ensure it's equitable and fair? How do we audit decisions? And how do we foster interoperability between technologies? We're soon to launch the State of the Connected Home report. It's one of techUK's keynote reports that's published every year. And one message that's coming through loud and clear on that is that people really do care about interoperability of devices at home. If they don't work together, it really puts them off. So we really need to take that seriously, both in the home, but more broadly too. But we also need to be mindful of the resilience of digital. Clearly, for the energy sector transition, you know, resilience is one of the key policy drivers for governments. They definitely want to avoid brownouts. So how can we build a digital energy system whilst also being mindful of cybersecurity risks and the resilience of the network, to ensure that mission critical operations do not fail? Kind of reflecting on that cybersecurity risk, you know, what does that mean for how we design future networks? I'm thinking here the energy network again. You know, what do we need to consider to trade off between those risks and potentially really costly reshaping of existing infrastructure? So they're not they're not small issues, and one that really demands widespread kind of stakeholder engagement discussion to get to the right answer. But at the same time, of course, we're up against the clock. You know, we do need to move through these issues at quite a pace if we're going to meet our target to meet net zero by 2050, but more importantly, really start to make considerable reductions in our carbon emissions sooner rather than later. Moving on to the tech sector itself. Now, there are a lot of material sustainability issues that are front of mind with our member companies at the moment. And I thought I'd just run through some of the ones that we're thinking about at the moment. So a really emerging issue for our members is around sustainable corporate governance. So human rights, labour standards in the supply chain, and the fair treatment of people. And actually kind of linked to that, we're seeing climate change actually rising up the agenda as a human rights issue in its own right. As climate change impacts communities and people across the world, that creates new responsibilities for companies whose supply chains depend on those communities. So a really interesting talking point, which is really only just starting to rear its head. Of course, the sector's own carbon footprint, and importantly, that must include the Scope 3 emissions. If you don't know what Scope 3 is, these are essentially emissions which are outside of an organisation's direct control. So it could include the emissions associated with the use of products and services, and the emissions associated with your supply chain. And even the waste management emissions associated with your own waste, or the waste that you are generating later through the products that you sell. Clearly, e-waste continues to get quite a lot of attention. It's the largest growing waste stream in the world. So there is a lot of thinking around how we can move to a more sustainable basis there. And in that same context, as we're seeing more companies and institutions set science-based target, they're increasingly asking questions around the carbon impact of digital services. So, you know, before it used to be quite simple, if you were producing a newspaper, for example, to actually track and measure the emissions associated with paper production and printing and distribution, and indeed the raw materials from which it's sourced. But actually trying to now attribute carbon to the cloud is becoming more challenging, particularly as so, you know, cloud has actually almost deliberately you know, broken the link between a physical aspect and the digital services that are run on that physical infrastructure. And really what this is requiring us to do is almost kind of artificially link it again. But there are some promising developments in that space. Another big driver is from the investment community, who are increasingly wanting to understand more about the carbon risks of the companies that they're investing in, and understand more about the wider environmental social governance of a company and their investments. And that's triggering new reporting requirements, new demand for data. The UK has recently consulted on mandatory climate disclosures in annual reports. And the G7 just recently also are committed to mandatory TCFD disclosures. So a real driver there. I've spoken a little bit about environment and human rights issues in the supply chain. And here, the key thing here to note is this is a big issue for the Commission at the moment. They're preparing new legislative proposals that will require companies to carry out mandatory due diligence for environment and human rights in supply chains. And that will in fact be linked to directors' duty, it'll be a director's duty. So really pushing that up to a board level requirement. Another issue is, I suppose, linked to the kind of e-waste point I made, but is more about how you design those circular business models. How do you design products, digital devices for a circular economy? And this has been really driven by the right to repair movement, which really took off in the States a couple of years ago and has led to new eco-design requirements for a whole host of products. And draft legislation is currently being discussed for smartphones and tablets, and new eco-design legislations just being prepared for laptops and computers. And more recently, we've got new legislative requirements for display, monitors and servers. So they're kind of slowly working through pretty much all the kind of end user devices that our sector depend on. And then, of course, as I've mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, the deployment of tech as an enabler of sustainability goals is really rising up the agenda. We're seeing all of our members really dedicating some of their attention and resources to thinking about how they can use their tech for good, which is great, but we could still do with more of that, I think. So in terms of the tech sector's own impact, now I have stolen shamelessly this slide from one that Ericsson presented at a conference that we ran last year called Decarbonising Data. And the link of the study from which the figures are based are in my slides, which hopefully will be circulated to you later. But as we can see from this slide, which contains lots of information I'll probably have to explain in 3 slides, but it's worth just remembering that despite the attention to data centers, if we look at the overall ICT carbon footprint, is relatively small compared to some of the other elements. So the use devices is where the majority of emissions reside. So half of these are emitted when they're in use. The other half, roughly, are generated during the manufacturing process. And then you can see, again, roughly a quarter attributed to networks and to data centers. And if you look at the overall sector's carbon footprint, it's roughly stayed stable for the last 10 years. In fact, it's starting to decline slightly. And that's despite a quite significant increase in data traffic. And what is being targeted at the moment is a 50% reduction in the carbon footprint by 2030. And obviously that's alongside that steep increase in data traffic that Cisco has estimated. And the reason why we can do both is because actually data is not directly correlated to the energy consumption. So if the infrastructure is there, data traffic can still rise without impacting energy use. The only problems that we might encounter is if peak demand exceeds what the network and data center capability allows, in which case that would require additional network and data center capacity. But generally, we've managed to avoid that in part. And equally, we are seeing a doubling of the efficiency in the data transmission in the network space as well. And as we know, data centers, for data center operators, energy use is the biggest operational use that they can control, and is something that they target ferociously. I think if anyone has been to a data center conference, you'll know that energy efficiency and energy consumption and the like dominates the program. So if I move on to the next slide, I wanted to share with you this slide. Now, this highlights the net zero trajectory that the sector has agreed to move towards. This was actually published as part of an ITU standard last year and updated fairly recently for user devices, which took a little longer to get the trajectory agreed. And partly because it's such a steep decline that's required by manufacturers of user devices by 2030 in order to meet the Paris Agreement. So this is what the sector globally has agreed to aim for. It was signed off by the Science Based Target Initiative with the ITU and the GSMA, the Global Sustainability Electronic that's the mobile industry global trade association, and also the GESI, which is the Global Electronic Sustainability Initiative. I think mobile networks are well on their way. In the UK, most, if not all, I think only but one have adopted a science-based target and in fact signed up to the Race to Zero, which is the campaign to join as an organisation if you want to show your commitment to climate action before COP26. User devices are perhaps a little behind in setting science-based targets, although I think the situation is likely to change in the coming months, I'm hearing. Data centers are more difficult. So some of the big data center operators again have committed to science-based targets and are ruthlessly going after these trajectories. It's more challenging for smaller independent data center operators, but again, you know, it's something which we are working with, certainly with our members on. So yeah, just to recap, as I mentioned, yeah, more than a third of the world's mobile operators have now signed up to the Race to Zero. And we are close to 20% by revenue of the world's ICT tech sector by revenue as well. And that's important because the UNFCCC has thinks that 20% is what you need to start creating the traction in the market to lead to real market transformation. So they've been encouraging 20% as a minimum. We're already exceeding that for networks, and we're close to that for the wider sector. We're also seeing ICT companies leading the world in the global procurement of renewables. You can see the links when the slides are circulated, but this is from Bloomberg New Energy News, whose analysis shows that the top 6 PPA off-takers of renewable energy in 2019 were all ICT companies, and the sector continued to dominate global corporate energy deals also in 2020. And if you don't know what PPAs are, they are power purchasing agreements, and they essentially help to directly bring new renewable energy onto the grid. So you're not cannibalizing renewables that maybe the public have helped to subsidize to bring online that other people need. You're bringing additional energy capacity onto the grid to service your operations. And in fact, this year, Amazon has become Europe's largest buyer of renewable energy. And last month, I think it was, secured the UK's largest corporate renewable energy deal, financing a kind of huge offshore wind farm in Scotland. For data centres in the UK, actually, we're making really good progress. Data centres are actually operate under something called a climate change agreement. And this is a negotiated agreement with government where energy intensive sectors either commit to improving their energy efficiency or cutting their carbon. It's a sector-wide agreement, so the sector have to meet it in total. And if they do so, they get a deduction off their climate change levy, which is essentially an energy tax. And data center operators had agreed to reduce PUE by 15% by the end of 2020. And provisional data shows that we've exceeded that to reduce PUE by 16.72%. So that's moving in the right direction too. We're starting now to see a real rippling out of interest in action. And this is being driven, I think, by a real shift in the market where major buyers are wanting their suppliers to provide them with more details of what they're emitting. So government is now is about to, I think, require all cloud providers to provide scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. A couple of weeks ago, government said if you're going to bid for a major contract, you not only have to provide a scope 1, 2, and 3 emission data, but you also have to set out an action plan to demonstrate how you're going to reduce carbon during the life of the contract. And a additional strategy government published in September last year called the ICT and Digital Services Strategy, Green in Government strategy, also signaled to the sector, if you want to sell to government, not only do you have to disclose emissions, but by 2025, you're going to have to sign up to a science-based target. We're going to be buying more remanufactured and refurbished products. You need to have circular design strategies in place and being actioned. And we want to have much better transparency of what's happening in your supply chain, with a particular focus on modern slavery and labour rights. So a real shift, I think, in government buying, which is rippling through the public sector, and also in the private sector, who clearly only want to, if they're setting as net zero targets, they only really want to be working with suppliers and partners who have the same values and are working towards the same goals as they are. But despite the progress I've just outlined, the biggest challenge by far is around digital devices. I mentioned that there's an increasing focus on circular economy. There's going to be a lot more attention and focus on devices in the coming months and years. So what we have already is Sen and Senelec worked over the course of 3 years to develop a new suite of standards to really define and set out how you measure performance characteristics of end devices. For example, how do you measure a durability in a product? How do you measure and assess its repairability? How easy it is to upgrade or remanufacture? Before these standards, these were words that we bandied about, but unless you can define them and measure them, you can't really legislate against them. So these were a really important foundation standards to really frame and build on in terms of legislation. We are starting to see more companies offering products or infrastructure as a service, and that's particularly in the B2B space. So, for example, in Erskine in Scotland, HPE remanufacture servers. And I think from memory, and sorry if I get it wrong, but they're remanufacturing around 100,000 servers a year. So not just from the UK market, but from across Europe. I've already mentioned the new government and customer requirements to buy more leased and remanufactured products. It'll be interesting to see how that is rolled out, because we still have an issue where people consider remanufactured or refurbished products to be inferior to new. So there's a real kind of cultural shift to really hitting those targets, I think. There's going to be increasing focus under eco-design regulation. I mentioned the draft legislation that's being developed for smartphones and for laptops, computers and tablets. That is likely to cover a whole range of things. So traditionally, eco-design has focused just on energy efficiency, and it's been really successful in cutting energy consumption from energy-using products. But now the Commission is really focusing on circular design. So what we saw in the first suite of legislative outputs under this new focus was a requirement to, for example, provide spare parts and have them available over 7 years from the point of purchase. For servers, there was new requirements that you have to be able to delete data easily from them so they can be reused. Others require that you share repairability information to professional repairers. We think there will be, for smartphones, new requirements to continue to provide software updates for a certain period of time, and the like. So you can start to get a sense of what the Commission is looking for. And actually, they're going to build on that by, one of the things we've seen is the Commission issuing a mandate to Sen and Senelec for industry to consider how they would apply those suites of standards that I mentioned earlier to servers. So servers was the first one to get some attention. This year, we're going to see a new consultation on the producer responsibility regime for waste electrical and electronics. I'm not sure if you're aware, but at the moment, what we have is a system where producers of products in the waste electrical and electronic space, well, producers of have to pay for the collection and treatment of WEEE at the end of life. Now, the collection network is basically framed around local authority household waste sites. So producer compliance schemes pick up waste electronics from that point and take them for recycling and treatment. What DEFRA are planning to do is to move that point of responsibility away from household waste recycling sites, but to the doorstep. Because one of the big issues at the moment is that if it can fit in a bin, generally people will put it in a bin. And it's just the larger, heavier things, which is inconvenient to do anything else with, that ends up being properly recycled. So we do have a real issue of waste electricals going in the bin. We know about around 155,000 tons is thrown away in this in black bins. So that desperately needs some attention. Another issue with devices is that people don't know what to do with the data on them at the end of life, so they hoard them. So it's something that needs to be targeted with a communications program. So we need to better explain to people how to delete data off devices once they are have finished with them. Encourage them to repair and sell on products if they've still got life in them, and to do the right thing when they're genuinely waste. Some of the other things that DEFRA are looking at is to adapt the fees so producers of good products pay less than producers of bad products. Exactly what criteria will make a product good or bad is still being discussed and defined, but we will definitely see modulated fees depending on attributes of the product and how environmentally sound they are. Potentially we might also see reduced fees for producers who operate their own circular business models, i.e. they place products on the market but take them back themselves and deal with it themselves. Yeah, big consultation on that expected, I think in October is the current thinking. Another big legislative discussion at the moment is around something called product passports. So the Commission have signalled that they want to produce these product passports as part of the Sustainable Products Initiative that was announced I think end of last year. With Brexit, it was easy to miss, but I think one of the most interesting proposals are these product passports, and essentially these will be digital product passports that contain information on a product that can be shared through to various actors in a supply chain. So for example, I might want to communicate to a producer, to a recycler, the chemicals that are in my device, so they know how to handle that device properly, or where a battery might be, so they can be mindful of that. Or you might want to have on there repair information that professional repairers can access. Alternatively, there might be information that you might want to give consumers. It's still quite at the inception stage, but the Commission have said, look, we're going to take a user-driven approach to this. The UK government has also signalled their interest in product passports, predominantly from a substance communication perspective. They want to encourage information on chemicals in products to be shared through the supply chain. But clearly, if the Commission's also looking at this, we've got to make sure the UK system works with the European one. So they need to be interoperable, one of those things that need to work internationally if they're going to work at all, because of course supply chains are international. And there's been some really good progress on due diligence on the sourcing of minerals. Intel, for example, worked with governments from the UK, Germany and the Netherlands, and a whole bunch of civil society actors to develop the European Partnership for Responsible Minerals. The automotive sector is now increasingly involved in that initiative, and the likes of Samsung and Apple are also involved. And they're doing some really good practical projects. For example, using blockchain to make sure that people are genuinely being paid for their work at a mine. And there's some really interesting collaborative projects that you can see on their website. Another really important initiative that the sector has been doing is through what was called the EICC, the Electronic Industry Citizen Coalition, I think it was called, but it's been renamed in recent years the Responsible Business Alliance. And they operate something called the White Smelter List, where the sector come together and audit smelters to make sure that the smelters aren't taking conflict minerals into their operations, which is proving to be really effective. So some really great collaborative work across the sector, but still challenges to overcome. The focus has been to date on 3 TGs, that's tin, tungsten, tantalum and gold, but there's a whole lot of other minerals and metals in products and devices. And so the challenge is to roll that out and apply that same diligence to other supply chains as well. And finally, I just wanted to do a little plug. One of the things that we do at techUK is we operate something very boring called the WE compliance fee, something that we have to bid to run, and which is subject to public consultation and approved by government. We do it on behalf of government, and essentially we are managing, as a result of that fee, a £20 million fund. Now, we have to invest that money in encouraging and supporting the delivery and operation of the UK's waste, electrical and electronic recycling system. And as I mentioned before, one of the kind of key emissions at the moment is around comms. So we have set up an organisation called Recycle Your Electricals, who are rolling out a national communications campaign at the moment. Because of lockdown, we have so far been very targeted. So really only doing local communications in local authorities that already have curbside collections of small mixed WE. That's about 10% of the UK, so still a lot to go after. But we are doing public, big kind of national PR campaigns as well to overlay the local communications. And on the website, there's a section called the facts and latest, and we do a whole bunch of research as well, technical research to support electronics recycling. So for example, we worked with the Environment Agency to look at the where persistent organic pollutants were in legacy WE plastics. These are chemicals that persist in the environment for a very, very long time. They've been found everywhere from breast milk to polar bear fat, and they bioaccumulate. So they really are a chemical of concern, and they were used with quite considerably within to insulate wires and anything that potentially generated heat. So what the research did was assess all the different streams of WE and how they're collected, understand where POPs are or are likely to be, which means that we've now been able to put in place across the UK facilities that separate out the POPs contaminated plastics from the clean plastics, and ensure that those contaminated plastics are burnt at high temperature incineration, because that's the only way you can destroy POPs. We've also done other research looking at the flow of E and WE through the economy to make sure that we are targeting the right things. That's where I got the 155,000 tonnes being disposed to bins statistic from. We're also,
Suzanne,
yeah,
sorry,
am I over?
1 minute, please.
Yeah, I've nearly finished. And there's also research on, we're about to publish some research on critical raw materials and the technology capability to start extracting those from electronics, because we really don't have the infrastructure to be able to do it at the moment. It's not economical. And it's not sometimes feasible technically. So we need a lot more innovation effort to be able to extract critical raw materials from electronics. So hopefully this will give us the insights to be able to ask government to help us in a much more targeted way than we've done before. But yeah, do have a look at that website. It's www.recycleyourelectricals.org.uk. And that's it from me. So thank you very much for your attention and time. I hope you found that interesting.
Suzanne, yes, indeed. And also, as well as your fine presentation, you gave an object lesson in how to deal with things that go knock on your door or go banging in the background of your room. So well done for that. Well, I noted your comments about government and how wide-ranging the efforts to do with government are, and that is really gratifying, because I note that some members of the government do seem to be rather obsessed with data, its privacy and surveillance at the moment. So it's good to see the widespread efforts that are going on in other areas. But now let's lead into our next presenter, Margot King. Now, she is a master's environmental technology student at Imperial College London, ICL. She's currently researching low plastic schemes in London as part of her final year project. Her interests include waste management, net zero, and sustainable cities. Now, I know the phrase waste not, want not, Margot, but I just can't believe that IT people are responsible for waste. Surely that's not true, is it?
Well, we'll soon find out. And thank you, Dalim, for that introduction, and Suzanne for that really interesting talk. So I'm going to be giving, let me see if these slides are working. Here we go. A presentation on that split into two main sections. So I will be covering some of the same areas as Suzanne, so hopefully some of it will be familiar, but also touch on some new areas as well. So I'll first be looking more at the carbon emissions associated with the ICT sector and video streaming and user devices before turning to e-waste or waste electrical and electronic equipment. So to kick off, the OECD defines the information and communication technology, so ICT, as a combination of manufacturing and services industries that capture, transmit, and display data and information electronically. And how you define the ICT sector really matters when calculating its carbon and energy footprint. For example, there are lots of subsectors such as ICT equipment manufacturing, IT services, data center operations, which we've seen some of those in Suzanne's talk. And some estimates account for end-of-life emissions, as well as upstream production and material extraction. So that would be a full life cycle emissions. But here I just wanted to show you one estimate. So here, this is from the ITU, so the International Telecommunication Union, and they've estimated that the global ICT sector's carbon footprint for 2015 was at 730 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and that this includes embodied emissions, so during the manufacturing stages as well. And I was slightly surprised to see that this equates to approximately 1.3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But this really is because, and again, this is a 2015 figure, but it is being estimated to be very representative of the 2020 situation. And that's down to the fact that the emissions from the sector have been relatively stable over the last few years due to improvements in efficiencies. So, and something that really has caught my attention in the last year or so, especially with people working from home is that there have been concerns over increasing video streaming and data traffic, and that's caused some media attention. So I put some headlines up here. But it's important to note that incorrect statements have been made that increased data traffic trends for streaming is causing an increase in the ICT sector's carbon footprint. And actually, when you think about the reality, video streaming accounts for a very small amount of emissions. So I quite like this. I took this from the Carbon Trust, has recently published a white paper on the carbon impact of video streaming. And so here you can see that it's been estimated that the European average carbon emissions per hour of video streaming is just 56 grams of CO2 equivalent per hour of video streaming. And to put this into context, this is the equivalent of microwaving 3.5 bags of popcorn for 4 minutes. So it is worth noting again that this figure will vary a lot depending on the grid's carbon intensity. So whether a lot of the electricity is coming from renewables or fossil fuels. And also this estimate doesn't include the embodied emissions of equipment and devices. So this will become more significant as the grids decarbonise and will be needed to factor into future calculations. And here you can see the breakdown of the ICT sector emissions by component. And again, I think Suzanne showed a fairly similar diagram. And it is interesting to note that user devices do make up the bulk of the sector's emissions. But actually, to go one step further, you can break that down to the devices within that. And so within this, the type of device does have a significant impact on the total carbon footprint. So for example, when you look at the footprint of the energy of the viewing device, watching on a 50-inch TV is roughly 4.5 times that of watching on a laptop, and roughly 90 times that watching on a smartphone. And so that does mean that shifts in ICT user device preferences from larger PCs, laptops to mobile devices is an energy efficient improvement, as mobiles and tablets are less energy intense than desktops. And that is why you can see these differences in associated emissions. So I've whizzed through that first section fairly quickly, but I now want to turn to something which is definitely a big issue for the tech sector and also just more broadly in the UK. So turning to what e-waste is, so this is e-waste, which is also known as electrical and electronic equipment waste. And this includes a wide range of products, which normally they just have to have a power or battery supply to count. So I've listed all the different categories on this slide here. So you can see from consumer equipment to small household appliance to IT and telecommunications equipment. And this equipment really becomes e-waste once it's been discarded by its owner as waste without the intent of reuse. And difficulties with this e-waste is that each product has different material content. It's disposed of and recycled of in different ways, and the different products are unequally harmful to the environment if they're not disposed of properly. And to put this in the UK context, so it was shown in 2019 a report that the UK generated the second most e-waste per capita globally at 23.9 kilograms per person that year. Again, you do have to take some of these waste statistics with a pinch of salt sometimes, because it's very hard to monitor this, but we do not want to, the UK does not want to be in a position where they're being ranked as the second worst globally. So this is definitely something we have to work on. And another study also estimated that more than half of UK households have at least one unused electronic device at home. And I myself am guilty of this, of having a old phone just in a drawer. And this is the problem that Suzanne mentioned of hoarding. Sometimes it's to do with not being sure of how to properly wipe our devices. Sometimes maybe you sort of think you'll keep it for later use, but at the end of the day, this is a problem that also needs to be addressed. And I wanted to include this slide here. This came up in the news only a few weeks ago, and you can probably make out that it's a sculpture of the G7 leaders, shaped like Mount Rushmore. But actually, if you look closely, they are all made of electronic waste. And this was put up in Cornwall ahead of the G7 summit. And it was really just to highlight the damage caused by inadequate disposal of these electronic devices and to flag up this issue. And you may be thinking, why is this a problem? So here are some of the main reasons. So first of all, there's the issue of lost resources. So old electricals contain valuable resources, such as rare metals. So by hoarding them or not disposing them properly and by just landfilling them, these resources then cannot be reused. Then there is the issue of environmental damage. So this can be caused from raw material extraction, so from the mining of these rare minerals and materials. And so by reusing, repairing and recycling e-waste, this limits the amount of new materials that are required and the associated environmental damage with that. And then also linked to environmental damage, there's the issue of climate change. So producing electricals does create carbon emissions. And again, you might be seeing a trend. This can also be reduced then by reusing and then recycling your old electricals to limit that. And lastly, if old electricals are just thrown away, especially ones that might still be working, ones that are still in your drawer, these can actually be resold, whether it's through a company or for charity. So there's actually a loss of financial value there. And I saw this diagram as well in a really interesting presentation. I thought it was worth including because it's essentially the periodic table, but it shows the different materials. So for example, there's the elements used in a smartphone you can see with the smartphone symbol. And depending on the color, you can see whether that element is a serious threat or whether it's from conflict minerals. So for example, mobile devices contain conflict elements like gold. And here the conflict refers to elements which are mined that might be linked to violence or human rights abuses, such as child labor. And then there's toxic elements like arsenic, and also rare elements such as indium. And it is interesting and quite scary to note that natural sources of 6 of the elements found in mobile phones are set to run out within the next 100 years. So when these slides are shared, you can have a look at this in more detail. This might be familiar now. I'll do a plug on Suzanne's behalf, but I really wanted to include some of the responses to this issue, as there is as stuff is being done right now. So Material Focus, which is not-for-profit organisation, has launched this new UK-wide Recycle Your Electricals campaign. And that's really to help reuse and recycle unwanted electricals instead of binning or hoarding them. And there are also other ventures and companies which are coming out that are aimed at addressing the problem. So Spring is an example of this, and that's aimed to get people to recycle their forgotten tech, so you can place them in pods and then you would get some money back for it. And again, there has also been some government responses to this issue. So some actually really recent updates. So in March this year, the government announced a new legal right to repairs by requiring manufacturers to make spare parts for products available for the first time. And that's important because that will help extend the lifespan of products by up to 10 years. And this is really targeting goods like TVs, fridges, and washing machines. And there are also take-back schemes. So again, Suzanne mentioned some of this before, and there's more consultations currently ongoing, so information's always coming out on this. But take-back schemes are really critical in ensuring the recycling and suitable disposal of e-waste. And from the 1st of January this year, larger retailers were required to provide in-store take-back of electronic waste if it is the same type as the customer is buying from them, or fulfills the same function. So to give an example, a larger retailer would take back a customer's old kettle when they buy a new kettle, or if they were buying a DVD player, they could maybe return their old video player. And that was really built on the fact that there's this demand for convenience of disposal. So if we make it as easy as possible for consumers to return and properly dispose of their e-waste, it's more likely to be done. And I'll just summarize my presentation now. So really going back to the start, despite these increasing data traffic and the rising use of devices, the ICT sector emissions have remained relatively stable. And this is largely down to two reasons. So firstly, the decreasing energy intensity of equipment, so the shift to things like mobiles and tablets, and then also the decarbonisation of electricity grids. So that's a greater reliance on renewables rather than fossil fuels. And within the ICT sector's carbon footprint, end user devices do account for the greatest proportion of emissions. But then within that, that's not equally distributed. So smartphones and laptops have lower viewing device carbon footprints compared to larger devices, such as TVs. E-waste, I have discussed, has been a problem in the UK. So that's in terms of disposal, whether it's being landfilled or just from people hoarding items. And there really is the need, you need to really help reduce the need for rare and conflict minerals, and also to reduce embodied emissions. So in response to this, there has been a greater push for reuse, repair and recycling of electronic equipment. And I think that is also, there is a small slide on references, which you can refer to, but I think I will stop my video for now.
Margot, that was great. I think everyone will agree with me. That was really super. And now that's a dilemma for me. I'm not sure now whether to watch that Netflix movie or eat the popcorn or juggle the two. I think I'll take to doing each for 3 minutes at a time. But lots of useful points there. Thank you, Margot. Now we're open for questions, and I'd like to ask, let me start off by asking one to Suzanne. Suzanne, you said lots about government and what they're doing, Margot likewise, but what is this? Does the government come to you, to techUK, for example, and ask what's happening, ask for your advice, or is it more that you need to lobby government to get them to do things?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and it's a bit of both. So take, for example, the waste electrical consultation that's coming up shortly. One of the things that we've been working with schemes and other trade associations is to come up with a better solution for business to business because at the moment the system is a mess. Even though it's going to cost more for our members, I think our members are really, really supportive of action that will close the gap on B2B. So we developed a paper, policy options. We held workshops with producers to get their buy-in, to make sure that it was compatible with the way that they do business. Then we presented that to DEFRA, and they invited us to present to devolved administration. So hopefully that will appear in the consultation. So that's a kind of lobbying type of approach. On things like eco-design, you know, government isn't the expert on things like servers. They're complicated machines, and they're used in, you know, very specific circumstances. And in those sorts of cases, they will come to us with questions. They will also commission independent advice. So the consultants they use at the moment is an organization called ICF, who also advise the American US EPA for their Energy Star. So they're really experienced on ERP, energy related product legislation. So they will speak to the consultants and then they will work with the manufacturers. So one of the things we're doing to help on servers, for example, is we're currently collating a database on the energy consumption of all the different models there are out there to give them the initial data they need to start thinking about what they want to do, essentially. So it's a bit of both, and of course, since we've left Brexit, we're doing a lot of work actually, you know, trying to keep the UK somewhat aligned with the Commission as well. So yeah, spending increasing amount of time monitoring what's happening in Europe now, and then communicating that back to the UK, so that we can keep parity, because the amount of work that's underway in the Commission at the moment is unreal.
Right. Okay. David, do you have other questions?
Yes, I've got 2 questions. They're in the chat. If you can, type them into the Q&A. So the first is a comment from Tony, and he says, the ITU footprint at 2014 doesn't mention CO2 produced by the breathing of the huge human population of the world, which I believe is significant.
Yeah, that ITU figure actually comes from a study that was published in 2018, and I think it's currently being updated, which looked at the carbon footprint of the ICT sector. So it didn't include anthropogenic emissions from humans. The scope was just the ICT sector, and in it, it also included media. As Margot mentioned, there is issues around boundaries, particularly as sectors become increasingly digital. What do you keep in, what do you keep out? But humans breathing is definitely not within our scope of control.
Okay, we've got a question from Paul. Even if a device can be repaired, it may still be cheaper to buy a new one. How do we get around that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Sorry, Margot, for jumping in again. I mean, one of the things that we've been asking for, and I see recently that Green Alliance, which is a prominent NGO, environmental NGO, has also called for it. Just a sec, Dylan, and I'll help you, is to actually, because a lot of the cost around spare parts is actually down to repair, the actual labour associated with the repair rather than the part itself. So one thing we asked for was, like what they've done in Sweden, is to have VAT reductions for repair labour, which could help to bring down the cost. Obviously, VAT is now within the UK government's control. It'd be great to see maybe VAT reductions on authorised spare parts as well. But ultimately, you know, we do face this challenge where it is inevitably cheaper to make things in a mass production factory than to create bespoke items. One thing that is around the corner, which may help, maybe 3D printing. You know, it could be in future that product passport contain CADs, which enable people just to download and print off spare parts in their home. Maybe that's what we'll see in future. We're not there yet, but you make a fair point. It is a challenge, and one that I don't think yet any government has really got to grips with.
I can add a tiny bit onto that. And I guess the point also is, even if it is cheaper to buy a new device, it's what you do then with that device that can be repaired. Because if there's the possibility of giving it to an organisation or a waste management authority that can then repair it and then still go on to sell it, whether that money goes to the company or to a non-profit, then at least you are still retaining those materials within the sort of circular economy. So ideally, it would be great if it was cheaper to repair rather than to buy a new one. But if it's not feasible to do that, then it's what you then do with that product.
Okay, thank you. We've got a comment. We can incentivize people by bringing back green shield stamps. I'm not sure what that means.
Before your time, David.
Yeah, I smiled when I saw that. It also reminds me of radio rentals, which I can remember. But yes, you know, perhaps there is, you know, a lot we can learn from the past. Some of the practices and ways we bought and shared things, you know, seem eminently sensible nowadays. I think in the context of the challenges we're now faced with.
A comment from me in terms of BCS. BCS is promoting and trying to encourage use of the Turing Trust, which was founded by, I think, the relatives of Alan Turing. And this is one of these charities that Margot has been referring to, an organization that you can give used equipment to, IT equipment to, and they will wipe clean and then redistribute it. I think they've got a number of charities in various countries and organizations such as schools in Africa where they repurpose old computers, etc. And so thoroughly encourage doing that. And if you can't think of another name, then think Turing Trust.
Yeah, we saw a wealth of community groups and organizations really stepping up during lockdown to try and encourage people to part with old laptops so they could be redeployed for good. I think the BBC also have a pretty comprehensive list of organizations that are willing to take donations if you can't get to the Turing Trust. But yeah, it was really positive to see the issue being addressed. So, I think en masse in so many areas by community groups up and down the country.
Okay, we've got a question for Suzanne. Do you have any more examples you can share about how tech deployments can help us meet the sustainability goals?
Yeah, so I mean, there are tons. So maybe I can just point you to some reports that you can look at your leisure. So PwC have done some really good reports called something like the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Sustainability and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which sets out how digital technologies are being used to address water quality, the energy transition, the shift away from combustion engines to supporting and helping monitoring climate. So, you know, recently the Met Office announced a huge investment in a supercomputer. I think it's called Vat 2. It's probably wrong, but anyway, you can Google it and find out the exact name. But they're investing in a supercomputer, which is going to really enhance their capabilities to model the impact of climate change around the world. And they're storing all the data being generated from the supercomputer into the cloud. So it means that academics, researchers and businesses, and of course other countries can access that data and model it and apply it for their own needs. I think Earth observation is another area which is really growing in prominence. So the use of satellites and drones together or separately being used for all sorts of things. I read today, for example, of Earth observation being used by the European Space Agency to monitor microplastics in the ocean. We've seen drones also being used to look at beach litter, to monitor for waste, illegal waste sites, and such not. We've seen IBM this last month launch their Mayflower, which is an automated ship which is collecting data on the chemical composition of the ocean, microplastics and other pollutants. And there are companies, for example, who are producing sensors that allow regulators to monitor water quality in areas which were hard to access in the past. So they would only monitor them once or twice a year, but now using these sensors, they are able to dynamically monitor water quality and flow. So there's just a few examples, but I mean, I could go on. There's so many.
Okay, thanks. So we've got a question from Peter. The IT industry has historically driven its customers or locked them into an upgrade path at both an enterprise and consumer level. So would we go about addressing this through global legislation or through society and cultural changes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think what we are seeing is companies still locking their customers into those agreements, but trying to encourage them to look at remanufactured, refurbished products in as well as new. So I know HP, for example, provide reports to clients which show what what climate, waste and water impacts can be avoided by purchasing refurbished product instead of new. Microsoft are committed to establish circular economy hubs to remanufacture servers at the end of life. Dell, for example, are designing their products to meet high iFixit scores. I don't know if you're familiar with iFixit, but they're an independent organization that essentially grades products on how easy it is to repair and gives them marks out of 10. It also provides tutorials and self-help guides for repair. So I think we're seeing companies innovate in slightly different ways. And of course, they're going to still want to keep their customers. They're still going to want to continue to sell. It's just the nature of what they are selling and how I think that is going to change. Really, what legislation I think is going to force OEMs to do is to level the playing field so that all products can be repairable, not just the best ones, that all products are fit to be refurbished at the end of one person's use of it, rather than just the best. So I think legislation has a role for leveling the market, and you'll always get companies innovating over the top. And of course, you know, when people demand it, if there's a sufficient customer demand, the companies will respond. So I think it's important also for people to be asking the right questions of their suppliers, demanding more from them, because I think until fairly recently, some of the sustainability experts in some rather large manufacturers for user devices said that, you know, we don't get asked any questions during the procurement process. You know, we're sitting here and we're not seeing that come through when it comes to purchasing. But that has changed. They're certainly a lot busier than they were 2 years ago, which is good news.
And I'll just add really quickly to that. So one other way that we're starting to see companies innovate a bit is this shift from selling a product to really selling a service. So at the moment, the reason why a lot of products aren't easily repairable and perhaps don't last as long as they should is because it's not in the company's interest for that to happen, because they want you to keep buying their product. But when we start to see companies really providing a service, for example, whether it's like a mobile phone contract where you always stay with the same provider and they provide new phones, or whether it's a car sharing scheme where you don't actually own the car, it's actually in the company's interest for that car or that phone to sort of work, because it's them that will be paying for the repairs and them that will, you know, that they will bear that cost. So I think if we push for this and we start to see this shift, hopefully that will start to limit some of these issues of planned obsolescence that we're currently seeing.
Thank you. Santana, do you have a final question?
Yes, I wanted to ask, how do we go about educating children and colleges about e-waste, and especially looking at IoT devices that are coming out by the hour these days, is what are we doing with that aspect of recycling IoT? Is there going to be some sort of standard, because some of them are quite small, and we need to make sure that we're not going to be just throwing them in these black bins. So do we have some programs for those two questions? Thank you.
Yeah, so at Material Focus, one of the things that we had always wanted to do was run a schools campaign. And we did plan something which was meant to be launched last year with Global Action Plan, which is an NGO that has a rich history of working with schools on sustainability issues and campaigns. Unfortunately, because of COVID, that got halted. And now Material Focus is pretty consumed with a lot of research for DEFRA to help support the consultation that's coming. It's definitely going to be rolled out as soon as we are able, because it was going to be linked to school collections as well. COVID has made it difficult to roll out, but it's certainly on the agenda and will be pursued when we're able to. But actually, you know, there's probably a lot more we can do with school kids. You know, the program we've got planned with Global Action Plan probably isn't enough. I think, you know, I've been saying it for decades. I know other people working in sustainability have as well. We do need to see a much stronger component on sustainability as part of the curriculum, and not just for, you know, third parties to try and hope that a school engages with an external campaign. So again, another one for government, but this time for the education department.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of the questions now, so we can hand back to Darlin.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. Now, a couple of points I want to make before we say thank you properly to our speakers is that during this debate, it's struck me that we perhaps ought to redefine cheap, because things might be cheap to buy a new one. But the point that Margot has made, I mean, it's often in the interests of printer manufacturers to make their printer hardware really cheap, because they are selling the ink as a product, and that's how they make their money. Likewise, built-in obsolescence is useful for manufacturers because it keeps us hooked into buying things from them. Likewise with mobiles as well. Why do we need to think of our mobile as a 6-month, a 9-month, a 1-year product to be thrown away? And I'm cognizant of the diagram that Margot showed us about the chemical components, and which are important and so on. Perhaps what we ought to be doing, Suzanne, is to be lobbying government to redefine cheap and rather make a valuable feature the longevity of a product, so that we have to keep things for 3 years unless it's absolutely not right that we should do so. Perhaps we should try and re-educate ourselves by children, as Santana said, and so on, to rethink our obsolescence, throw it away culture.
So economists or green economists have long been arguing for external environmental externalities to be factored into the price of things, so that the price isn't just the literal price of materials, but reflects the impact of a product throughout its entire life cycle. So I think there's some quite serious economic thinking about that, you'll be pleased to hear. I mean, I would argue that, you know, there isn't necessarily, you know, widespread planned obsolescence, rather than what I see is that things are designed for a price point to make it competitive against other manufacturers. And it's the race to the cheapest on the market, which has driven down the quality of the product rather than planning for obsolescence. We do see, I mean, I don't think that mobile phones are designed for 1 or 2 or even 3 years, but for much longer. I mean, mine is already, I bought mine remanufactured and it's already going for 4 years. So with everything now in the cloud, you can easily offload things off your phone, you can back up your data, and the software updates do mean that you can continue to have the features that you might want from a new phone without necessarily upgrading, but there is still a long way to go. That there does need to be a greater focus on durability, but that's, you know, what we see is that people discard their phone before it fails most often. So it's not only just the design, it's also a cultural shift to hang on to things for longer and be happy with old.
Absolutely. And again, another point Margot made, or we just stick it in our drawer.
Yeah.
Why are we doing this? There are numerous points that have come out of this, which I found really interesting and useful. So thank you. Now, something I should say in terms of what we are doing in BCS and our North London branch and so on, is that we are actually discussing with IBM, one of the IBM team that's been working heavily on the Mayflower, that transatlantic autonomous vehicle, autonomous ship that's been going across the Atlantic and doing all sorts of experiments as it goes. So quite possibly we'll have one member of the IBM team come to speak to us at a future date. But other things that have come out, I mean, I've just been looking through the chat here, and it's amongst this, the comments I can see, somebody has said, this has really helped me to understand the breadth of the subject and way beyond my own role as an architect working for a service provider. So thank you. Somebody else has said, excellent point, Margot, about service-based business models. Someone else says, great presentations, really informative. Thank you. And so numerous other people have said how much they have found these presentations useful and fruitful. So I want to add my voice to that as well and say thank you very much, Suzanne and Margot, for a very informative and entertaining webinar with some great things that we really should take note of and build on for the future. And as it's London Climate Action Week, please do go and look at the LCAW website, see the other good things that are going on, and try and partake of some of those too. Meanwhile, I'm going to let slip that I know where Margot's going, not immediately after this, but sometime in the future. Again, Suzanne, it touches on something you mentioned. You mentioned PwC and the report they've done. They've done lots of reports, I know, lots of great things, including with the World Economic Forum and others, about the sustainability goals for the 2020s. How are we going to get to 2030? Still have a world worth living in, those sort of things. And it's that team that, in fact, I believe Margot is going to be joining fairly soon as an intern.
I'm here already.
There we go. So we've got our plant in the future, as it were. That's you, Margot, and we wish you the very best of luck with that new role. Thank you very much, and look forward to sharing these slides with you. Look forward to sharing the video with you just as soon as we can get it off the press. In other words, in about a week's time. But meanwhile, thanks very much for joining us. Remember, we have got another great webinar on the show it. Yeah, there we go, on the 7th of the month. And that's new technologies for data protection. Maybe we should share that with some of the government ministers. Well, why not invite them? Suzanne, please invite them to come and take part in this webinar. Data protection and surveillance and all those sort of things. We've got it covered. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean that. Come and join us. Enjoy. See you later. See you next time. Bye-bye.